until the night, till Shkia. So please, we learn Le'ilei Nishmas, Chaya Esther, Tzipora Bas Eliezer, Shevin Elias Neshama. So we're looking at the Evan Shlomo Perek Aleph. And so again, let's look at Sif Gimel. We spoke it out outside, we'll read it inside. The Gra in Sif Beis had made the point, again taken from Mishlei, that the Iker Chiyas Ha'adam, the main purpose of a person's life, is to strengthen himself in breaking his bad midos. V'im lav lama lo chayim, right? If one doesn't do that, there is no purpose for his life. Lama lo chayim, right? An amazing thing. Now Sif Gimel begins to articulate the philosophy of how do you work on your midos. So he says, again, I mentioned it at the very end, Haraitza lasha midarka hera. If you want to remove yourself from your bad pathway, now obviously he's talking about midos here because that's the context. Tzarech lishkal midaisav b'maznei tzedek. You have to weigh your midas on an accurate scale. Maznei tzedek means a righteous measurement. Ki mitchila tzarech lispainin al midaisav haraim ulahakiram heitev. Number one, you have to identify what your bad midos are. Now that's not always so simple as we think, because we have a lot of defense mechanisms, meaning sometimes we don't even admit to ourselves that a certain midah is bad. I think the Sfas Emes says, but it's more of a humorous remark, but it's an emistic of Ort, when it says, Kol machlekes shehi l'shem shamayim, sofo lehiskayim. Pirkei Avos says, any machlokes that's l'shem shamayim, it will endure. A machlokes that's not l'shem shamayim is not going to endure. And the Mishnah gives an example. A machlokes l'shem shamayim is Hillel and Shammai. Right, so the pashtus is that even though in a machlokes Hillel and Shammai, or Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, but we still learn Beis Shammai. We learn Beis Shammai, we analyze Beis Shammai. In fact, Beis Shammai is mentioned first, and the Gemara says that's the kavod that Beis Hillel showed to Beis Shammai, to mention Beis Shammai first. So Sofo Lehiskayim in Pashtus is a positive thing, that it was a machlokas, we still are machshiv the other view. A machlokas not l'shem shamayim, the Mishnah says, is kairach v'yadasei. So first of all, people ask the kasha, kairach v'yadasei, that's the same side. If you're giving a machlokas, it would be Korach versus Moshe, but the answer is Pashit. Moshe was l'shem shamayim, so you can only mention one side. In other words, the machlokas, not l'shem shamayim, is Korach's side. Or some say different, that when you have a machlekes not l'shem shamayim, even the people on the same side, each of them has their own agenda. Kairach v'yadasei. And Rashi goes through this. Rashi says, Korach wanted one thing, Dasan and Aviram wanted something else, the Levium wanted something else. Kairach v'yadasei. But be it as it may, the simple pshat of the Mishnah, for sure, is Sofo lehiskayim is a positive thing, Ein Sofo lehiskayim is a negative thing. Right? But B'derech Jerush, the Sfas Emes says, it doesn't fit the Mishnah, and I'll tell you, but the Sfas Emes says that Sofo L'skayim means when you have a machlekes that you think is L'shem Shamayim, it'll go on forever because you'll never see that you're making a mistake. Right? A machlokes not L'shem Shamayim, meaning if I know I'm not L'shem Shamayim, so at some point I'll realize, I really shouldn't continue. When you're from in your machlekes, that's the worst thing at all. In fact, Rav Schiller, he should be well, once said, this was the pshat at the end of Tachanan, which is a pasuk. Azreinu l'kei yeshenu al dvar kvod shemecha, right? Save us, or help us, for the honor of your name. V'hatzileinu v'chaper al chateseinu l'man shemecha, atone for our sins for your sake. So the pashtus is, we don't deserve it, but for your sake. So he says, you can read it differently. The sins that we committed, l'man shemecha, chateseinu l'man shemecha, that needs a real kapara. So this ties into what the Gra is saying here. Because the Gra says, the first step towards being masakein, your negative midas, is to identify your negative midas. don't kind of say, yeah, I get angry when I see people, not being from, but that's because, I feel the kavod of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, is it that? Maybe it's that. Or is it, I just get angry because I don't like, people to do things that, don't make me comfortable or whatever it is. Some say that this is the remez of Achilas Morar. We talk about Yitzias Mitzrayim. The Baal HaTanya has a famous, beautiful vort that, what does it mean in the Haggadah? Chayav Adam liras asatzmai kilahu yatzim Mitzrayim. Each person must regard themselves as if they themselves were taken out of Mitzrayim. So the obvious kasha is, what does it mean? I mean, I was not in Mitzrayim. I mean, it's a make-believe story. I could be grateful for what Hashem did for my ancestors. Yeah, that's for sure. But I am chayav to feel that I myself was in Mitzrayim. What's the pshat that I myself was in Mitzrayim? So I'm going to give you 3 quickie answers, because the third one will tie into the Gra. Answer number 1 is what the Rambam says. And the Rambam says a very fascinating thing. The Rambam says, it doesn't mean you were in Mitzrayim, but you got to make believe as if you were in Mitzrayim, because the Rambam says you're using the kayach hadimyain. You're using the power of imagination to generate gratitude to Hashem. Meaning it's hard for us to be grateful for Yetzias Mitzrayim, so you have to imagine what it's like to be a slave, what it's like to be whipped, and what it's like to be humiliated, and what it's like not to have any privacy in your life. And think about it, imagine it, be mitzayer it in your mind. And then you'll be makir tov to Hashem. So, according to the Rambam's pshat, it's not that I actually was there, but the way I reach a level of hakaras hatov is to be mitzayer, the kayach of dimyan, the kayach of imagination, in order to be makir tov. Because that's the only way you'll be makir tov. Lahavdil, a million havdalas, it's like what they call in acting, they call it method acting. Right? If any of you in a prior Gilgal were connected in any of this to a movie or whatever it is, so a method actor is an actor who spends months and months and months to get into the role, to feel. In fact, they even have stories of some actors who had to play really, really bad people, so they had to make themselves like Rishayim, and they committed suicide because they were connected to the Sitra Achra, that's method acting. Now, Rav Chaska Levenstein, Taka said that one of the qualities for a Baal Mussar is to have a good imagination. A Baal Mussar should be mitzayer, Yitzias, the Avdas of Mitzrayim, Yitzias Mitzrayim, Kriyas Yamsuf, Matan Torah, that we need to have it not just as a very vague thing, nice thing that happened, but to really, really be marked. Right, so that's answer number 1, that Chayav Adam Liras Asatzim Akihu Yatzim in Mitzrayim is the Kayach HaDimyan. Answer number 2 is Al Pi the Zayir. The Zayir Taka says, every single neshama of Klal Yisrael that was ever born was meshubed in Mitzrayim. In other words, my physical body, I was not in Mitzrayim, my neshama was. That all neshamas are nichlal, or were nichlal, in the 600,000 people who left Mitzrayim, and therefore my neshama was Taka and Eved in Mitzrayim. That's answer number 2, Al Pi the Zayir. Answer number 3 is from the Baal HaTanya. The Baal HaTanya says very beautifully that Mitzrayim does not only mean Egypt, but Mitzrayim is a lashon for limitation and boundary. When David HaMelech says in Hallel, Min ha-meitzar karasika, I call out to Hashem from the narrow place. Meitzar. So Mitzrayim is a lashon of mitzarim. Same letters, mitzarim, boundaries, limitations, blockages. And the Yesod HaDvarim is that every person has their own Mitzrayim. I can have, in fact, the Midas Rais are my Mitzrayim. The Mitzrayim that could be arrogance, it could be gaiva, it could be laziness, right? The Daled Yesodis, it could be taiva, right? Mamish the Daled Yesodis. But the Baal HaTanya says they are Mitzrayims because they are things that block me. The Gra didn't connect it linguistically to Mitzrayim, but certainly everything the Gra said is the same thing, that they're the levush for your Torah and your mitzvahs that connect you to Hashem. Otherwise, you're not connected. So the Balatanya says like this: when HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Mitzrayim, He put into the Bria a kayach that we can be liberated from our own inner Mitzrayim. So the Chay of Adam Liras Asatzmai, Ki'ilu Hu Yatsa, is that you're maimin, that through the kayach of Yetzias Mitzrayim, you can be Yatzai from your own Mitzrayim, which is a very, very powerful idea, that sometimes a person feels helpless. They feel like, their midos rise, rule over them, their anger, or whatever it would be. But no, this is the kayach of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So it says that every step of the Seder, I'm not going to go over everything now, maybe closer to Pesach, I'll be marich a little bit more, but every step of the Seder therefore has a double meaning. It's keneged Yetzias Mitzrayim then, but it's also mechoven keneged ma Yetzias Mitzrayim now. So in that way, let's take Achilas Morar. That's really the point I'm going to connect it here. It says, what's the idea of Morar? So Morar is a zecher to the Avdus. You remember the slavery? Well, the first step in your own Yetzias Mitzrayim is that you're makir, you're mariras. You're makir that you are in a state of slavery. In other words, that's what the Gra is saying. The Gra says you have to be makir your midas rise, and not give yourself excuses and not deny things. Yeah, we're not talking about making public announcements. We're not talking about, I gotta, give a clap in the beam and say, I want you to know, like the AA meetings, I'm an alcoholic. You don't say, I have an anger problem. These are private things, but at least legabe yourself, to be makir that you have something to work on. Because the very first step, and this is true in all Avodas Hashem, the very first step to getting on a good derech is to be makir you're on a wrong derech. Because if we're not makir on a wrong derech, then it's not shaykh to correct ourselves in any way. I remember, many years ago when I worked at a law school, so I had to commute from Silver Spring, Maryland to Baltimore. I don't know if anyone knows the East Coast or that part of the country. So when you drive from, let's say, Silver Spring, which is near Washington, to Baltimore, you have to go north. And the major highway is 95 north, right? 95 north. So when you go 95 north and you don't watch, it turns off into 95 south, right, in the far right lane. So you got to, watch what you. So when I first started driving, I wasn't that familiar with the neighborhood, and my mind was wandering a little bit. So all of a sudden, I'm driving on 95, and all of a sudden I see the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial. If you don't know you don't know the significance of that, but you don't see it on the way to Baltimore. You only see it when you go to Virginia. So all of a sudden I'm noticing these beautiful buildings that I had never seen before, and it occurred to me, am I on 95 South? Now, I didn't want to, it was still a pre-conscious thought, really, I didn't want to be maida to myself that I was on 95 South, because I didn't really know how to correct it. So I started telling her, I still can't explain this, but this is how the human being works. This is how the Yetzer Hara, the shtus in life. So I started telling her, maybe you never noticed, that you can see these things from Baltimore. You didn't notice. It's not a raya. I didn't want to say. I didn't want to admit. But what's the pshat? So you keep on going in the wrong direction, because I didn't want to be maida. In investments, this happens all the time. This is called throwing good money after bad. You invest in a business. The business fails. So you figure, I don't want to waste. I wasted $1,000 in a business that's failing, so I better put in more money, because maybe it'll get better. And I'm sure you've heard Albert Einstein's famous statement that the definition of insanity is when you do the same thing over and over again and you think you're going to get a different result. Right? Obviously, you got to do something that works. So Moror is the lekach, the limit of Moror is, hey, you want to leave Mitzrayim? First be Maida, you have a Mitzrayim. Until you're Maida, you have a Mitzrayim. It's not shaykh to leave the Mitzrayim, because you don't yet think you're in a matzav of abdus. And that's why the Gra makes the point here, going back to the Gra here, that the first step is to identify what your midas rais are. Now, I would add, although he doesn't make the point here, but he makes it other places and other Mussar make it, that, we call this whole process generally called cheshbon hanefesh. And the word cheshbon hanefesh is actually a very interesting term. In modern Hebrew, an accountant is called a roeh cheshbon. So indeed, the most accurate translation of cheshbon hanefesh is spiritual accounting, or accounting of the soul. Now, accounting is a very nice word to use for this, because when you're an accountant, you have to record both debits and credits. You don't only record debts, you also have to record the assets and the liabilities, the debits and the credits. So in Cheshbon HaNefesh too, this is a very important idea. We tend to think of Cheshbon HaNefesh like, okay, what are all the ways I'm wrong? What are all the ways that I'm bad? That's only half of it. That's like an accountant who only records the debts and not the assets. And then what happens to a person? A person gets bracha, and a person gets depressed, a person feels like a failure, a person doesn't have the psychological energy. So keep in mind that the word cheshbon hanefesh connotes an honest accounting of yourself, which is kailel both the chesreinis and the milas. A person should identify milas as, I'm pretty good in this. Because that's not gaiva. First of all, it's not gaiva because you're not boasting about it, and it's not gaiva because it's essentially giving you chizuk to know that there's something here that I can work on. Okay, so people make a mistake when they look at cheshbon hanefesh is only my averis. It's also my milas. In fact, I think I had mentioned this was a little problem. The Chazon Ish had a number of issues with what's called the Mussar movement, the Tnuas HaMussar. He says he knew many of the Gedalim of the Tnuas HaMussar. I mean, not Rabbi Yisrael. Yisrael was before him, but the second and third generation, the Alter Slobodka, the Chazon Ish knew, and he said he was machshav them, and they were kadosh. In fact, he once said, I'm against the Shitas HaMussar, but I'm against the Misnagdim of the Shitas HaMussar even more, because they were mezalzel in the kavod of very, very great people. But the Chazon Ish had certain machloksim with the Shitas HaMussar. Now, obviously, it's not like, I'm against midos tovos. That wasn't the issue. Obviously, that wasn't the issue. But there were two things. This is actually a little complicated, but there are. I'll just make it simple. There are two nekudas. I think I mentioned this that the Chazon Ish had about the Mussar movement. Nekuda number one is he says that depending on who does this, Mussar sometimes is so microscopic in analyzing my chesreinis that it could cause certain personalities to get very depressed, get very sad, and not be makir their milas. And the Chazon Ish felt that was destructive in Avodas Hashem. To over-scrutinize yourself can sometimes, for some people, not be the best way that they grow in their Avodas Hashem, because they could be prone to depression and atzvus, which ultimately would be worse. And he felt that Mussar was too overly medayek in, my motives, like everything is scrutinized, did I daven mincha with enough kavana, whatever it would be. So the Chazon Ish felt the person should generally have an attitude of avodah b'simcha, and he thought that Mussar would be a problem for some people. Now the truth is, it is a problem for some people, depending on the Sefer Mussar and the like. Rabbi Yisrael Reisman, the Rav from Flatbush, who is a huge, one of the world's largest shiurim online and the like. So he's here every summer, right? Many of you might be zeicha to know. He's Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'das, a Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'das, very, very chashuv Talmid Chacham. He was very close to Rav Pam. Rav Pam was mamish his Rebbe Mufak. And he once said that Rav Pam told him as a bacher not to learn Mesilas Yesharim. How can you tell somebody? I'm sure Rav Reisman, I didn't ask him, I'm sure Rav Reisman learned Mesilas Yesharim since then. But as a bacher, he was told not to learn Mesilas Yesharim. How can you tell a person not to learn Mesilas Yesharim? Mesilas Yesharim is considered, not that we could rank it, but the greatest of the Sifrei Mussar. But the answer would be that the standards are sometimes so high that people get depressed. What's the use? I can't. I mean, the lowest madrega of the Ramchal, the lowest madrega. These are 12 madregas that bring you to Ruach HaKodesh, right? So the lowest madrega is Zehirus. That's the lowest, right? So what is Zehirus? Oh, I keep Kol HaTorah Kula B'chlalu B'frat. That's the starting point, right? So kind of, I'm shot down before I begin, right? What about and then I'm going beyond that, So he felt that for certain Bachrim, actually it's interesting, the Bachrim who are especially conscientious, B'dafka. Some people can learn Mesilas Yesharim. Unfortunately, it may not impact on them so much. So for care, they can learn it. It's not going to make a difference. But sometimes the people who would be most influenced, sometimes it's like dangerous medicine, the Chazon Ish held on some level. And the second thing that bothered him, and this is actually very fascinating, was that he felt that Mussar was sometimes based on Makoros that were not Torah-dik Makoros. So Mussar actually borrowed a lot, or used a lot of psychology, used a lot of understandings of the unconscious, based on Chochma Bagoyim Tamin, that we can take from the Umos HaOlam even, although a lot of the psychology was B'dafka from Jews, but Jews who were not from Freud or whatever it would be, we can take the insights from outside of Torah and we can use them to understand. I think I mentioned to you Rav Wolbe, during World War II, managed to get to Switzerland that was neutral, and he apprenticed himself to Dr. Jean Piaget, who was a very, very, maybe the greatest child psychologist in the world, a guy. And Piaget's specialty was, how do children develop moral judgments? So Rav Wolbe held that it would be kedai for him to learn from Piaget in order to understand how midos are formed and how personality development occurs. Because that's nogeya, our own avoda and our chinuch habanim and everything else. So the Chazon Ish actually didn't like that approach that much because he said, everything should come from Torah, you shouldn't have to go to psychology. So those were the two tainas that the Chazon Ish had. One was that Mussar, for some people, could inculcate an atzvus and a sadness in Avodas Hashem. And the other aspect was that Mussar was sometimes, again, you have to look at every Baal Mussar was different, but sometimes Mussar had a certain zika, a certain connection to the Chachma of the Umos HaOlam, and the Chazon Ish felt that was not so appropriate. Now, having said that, he certainly was tremendously machshiv, the Gedolei HaMussar, and he considered them tzaddikim and kedoshim, whose kavanah was totally l'shem shemayim. Now, he had another disagreement, which is not about the Mussar movement itself, but with one of the personalities of the Mussar movement, although he never mentions them by name. That was the Alter of Nevardik. That does not go to Mussar per se, but that goes to the union of bitachon. The Chazon Ish wrote Gavaldig Sefer called Emuno Bitachon, right? Famous Sefer. I think they've translated it in English as well. Very poetic, very beautifully written. People don't always know the Chazon Ish was actually a very, besides all of the million milas that he had as a gadol and a kadosh, he happened to be a very extraordinarily poetic. When he wasn't writing in halacha is halacha, but he was a very poetic person. He wrote poems and ruchniistic poems. And Munu Bitachon, which is a hashkafa book, is written in a very poetic way, very, very amazing. And the Chazon Ish develops there the idea that Gamzu L'Taiva, again, I'm digressing a little bit, Gamzu L'Taiva is not simply the idea that everything will be good. Everything will be good. You want the chayla to get better. If you have bitachon, the chayla will get better. You want $1 million, have bitachon, you'll get $1 million. And if you don't get $1 million, it's because you didn't have enough bitachon. There was such a shita of bitachon. And the Chazon Ish said, that's not true. It's just not true. The Eibishter has many, many cheshbainis. Sick people sometimes don't get better. We don't know always why. In all probability, you want $1 million, you're not going to get $1 million, and the like. Rather, bitachon does not mean all of the outcomes I want I'm going to get. But it means that everything that happens is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore it's good. It's good even if it's not what I want. You see, otherwise you have a really crazy situation. I mean, let's assume, Rahman al-Islam, that somebody's mother is ill. And the person davens and davens and davens and davens. And Tehillim and Staka and learning, and other people daven. And the person dies. Now, if you go with the idea, if only you had enough emunah, of course this wouldn't have happened. So what does that tell the person? It either tells the person, you didn't have enough emunah, that's why this happened. Well, he's not going to, I mean, besides the fact that he lost his mother, he's not going to feel very good about that. Or the other way around, if the person feels, I was a maimin gomer, then chas v'shalom, the person will lose his emunah. He'll say the whole thing is a fake. So the Chazon Ish held that this was a dangerous approach, but dafka a dangerous approach, and therefore he said, the gamzu l'toiva doesn't mean I'll have a happy ending, but it means it all comes from Hashem, and therefore it is good, even if I don't understand it. So what's interesting is he doesn't identify who his bar palukta was, meaning he says, some people say bitachon is this. He says, this is a tois gomor. A big, big mistake. Now, he doesn't identify who are the some people. But indeed, apparently he did identify it originally because when Emunu B'Tachon was published after his death, they took out a few pages. The family took out a few pages. They didn't want to have some pages in there. And I'm not sure if it was officially restored, but in those few pages he mentions Navardik, the Navardik Shita, as Badafka, the Shita, that he was misnaged to. So that's an interesting. So that's not about Mussar per se, but the Alter of Navardik was one of the great Bali Mussar. By the way, the Alter of Navardik was Rav Chaim Shmulevitz's grandfather. It's interesting. Rav Chaim's mother's father. Rav Chaim's father was the son-in-law. Rav Rafal Shmulevitz was the son-in-law of the Alter of Navardik. So it's interesting. And the Stipler, Rav Chaim Kanevsky's father, the Stipler, was a Talmud of the Alter of Navardik. So Navardik actually has a strong hashpah among Gedolei Eretz Yisrael, and indeed, to some degree, even the bitachon idea. Even though the Chazon Ish is also a Gavaldik Kayach, but you'll sometimes hear B'dafka in Eretz Yisrael, this idea that bitachon, will get you everything. So it's interesting. Maybe that's the hashpah of maybe. I don't know if the Stipler or Rav Chaim Kanevsky ever said it beferish, but kind of they have the Navardik gene, so to speak, and it kind of entered the consciousness. Okay, so why did I bring this up? I have no idea, but I think I know why I brought it up. I brought up a lot of things, but there was only one nikud I wanted to be mitzi from you, and that is when the Gra says you have to be makir your bad midas. I would add at this point, you also have to be makir your good midas. And that was the Chazon Ish's point, that a Mussar that focuses on my chesrenes is going to be pogum in that particular way. Okay. But it is interesting, once again, that the Gra says, step number 1 is identify the midas rise. Don't deny it. Don't cover it up. Admit to yourself what it is that you have. So that's step number 1. Now, step number 2, just reading weiter, Ulachanech es atzmai lahatais kol mida ra el kitzei ahipach. Again, I mentioned this at the end of last class, but now we're seeing it inside. And then you must, after you've identified them, you must then train yourself to eventually move to the opposite direction. Now this, it is from the Gra, because every sentence in the Even Shelaima is from something the Gra said. That's very true. But in reality, the Gra himself got this nekuda from the Rambam. Right? This is the Rambam in Hilchos Teis, and I don't know if the Rambam had a makar in Chazal for his mashal. It's a famous mashal the Rambam gives about a tree. Let's say you have a tree that you want the tree to grow straight, but the tree somehow got bent over, so it's bent over. So if you simply, assuming it's still soft enough, pliable enough that you can move it without breaking it, right? That's the thing. So if I simply bring it up 90 degrees, it's going to still bend. In order for me to get it to go in the middle, I got to pull it in the opposite direction for a while, mikotze el akotze, and then there's a pull in that direction and a pull in that direction. It'll get adjusted in the middle. So the Rambam says the goal is not to go to extremes, right? This is the Rambam's famous shita called, they call it the Shvil HaZahav, the golden road, or the golden mean. Now, the Rambam himself does not use the word Shvil HaZahav. In fact, Shvil HaZahav is a translation of Aristotle, who used the phrase, whatever it is in Greek, the golden mean. So people apply that term to the Rambam because indeed the Rambam is saying the same thing as Aristotle, that the goal of personality development is to be in the middle, that when you go to extremes, it's often going to be destructive. So an example would be, let's say selfishness. Everyone is maida that selfishness is a bad midah, just to care about me. And everybody's moda, generosity, caring about people, chesed, is a good midah. So you might think, okay, if selfishness is bad, generosity is good, then I should take everything that I have and give everything away and not care about myself at all. So the Rambam says, no, kishem, that selfishness is bad. Generosity to an extreme is also a bad thing, because then you're not going to take care of your family, and then you're not going to take care of yourself, and then whatever, you could endanger your health, etc. So a person has to have a certain amount of what we might call the bad midah, we might call selfishness. That's why Chazal said in Hilchei Tzedakah, Hamavazbeis al Yavazbeis Yosher Mechaimish, that a person is not supposed to give. Right? We give meiser. To give 10%, there's a chiyuv. But if you can give more, it's good to give more. Give up to a chaimish, 20%. But more than a chaimish, not supposed to give. Now, there are exceptions. Bill Gates would be permitted to give more than a fifth. There is a rule, usher muflag, that has, so much that even if he would give, 80%, he'd have so much to live on. Okay, but for most people, they're actually told they should not give more than a chaimish. Now, the truth is, the Alter Rebbe in the Rav Shulchan Aruch has such a huge exception to this. He has an exception that is mevatel the rule. That's very schwer. He says like this. He says, yeah, it's true. The mitzvah of tzedakah, you're not supposed to give more than a fifth. But he says like this. This is what the Alter Rebbe says. But let's say a person needed a life-saving operation. Meaning if he doesn't have the operation, he's going to die. Pikuach nefesh. For pikuach nefesh, I can certainly give more than a fifth. I can give everything away. So says the Balatanya, if a person is giving tzedakah because he wants to do tshuva for his averos, that's pikuach nefesh, because his life, his spiritual life, is in danger. So he says the rule of mevazbez al yevazbez yeshem mechaimish does not apply when a person gives tzedakah for kaparas averos. Now, there's always a problem in halacha when you create an exception that is so big that the rule will never apply. Give me a case of somebody who doesn't have to give tzedakah because of kaparas averos. There's like no such thing. So essentially, the Alter Rebbe said that the chaimish rule is totally batal because you're always doing it for kaparas averos. Okay, that's his chiddush. A lot of poskim don't agree. But be it as it may, the very fact that Chazal, putting the Alter Rebbe aside for a moment, the very fact that Chazal were kaveya, don't give more, indicates you need to hold on to something. So the goal, the Rambam says, is not to go from selfishness to selflessness, but to be in the middle, in which you care for people, but you also provide for your mishpacha. But in order to uproot the selfishness, there has to be a tekufa, maybe a short tekufa, in which I go to the other extreme. I go to the other extreme to be aiker from myself, that nitiyah, to selfishness. And then I can pull back and be a little more I'm using selfish, I don't mean it in a negative way, a little more selfish in order to take care of my family and the like. And this is what the Gemara says here, that you initially have to be merachik yourself to the ketsei ha'acharain, the other way, and that will eventually bring you to what is called the shvil hazahav. And again, this is true for a lot of things. Anger. Now, anger is a very bad midah. Kas is a very, very bad midah. So if a person is working on kas, you have to train yourself for a while that you don't get upset over anything. Now, the truth is sometimes there are reasons to have kas. If someone is not doing something right, then you want to correct them. Chinuch habanim. But if you're if you want to be margo yourself to be oiker kas, you have to go for a while to the other extreme. So he says, he gives an example. Kagayin mikas, from anger, to chemla. Chemla is compassion, meaning whatever you do is fine, don't worry about it. Whatever you do, I never get upset. Or gaiva, to shiftless, right? You got to go from arrogance to lowliness, bedafka, lowliness. But that's temporary, that's not permanent. But then he adds an interesting thing in parentheses. Again, this is all from the Gra. Avolo yidaleg bepam achas el katzei hahipuch. But you don't go to the extreme in one fell swoop. Rak yelech la'at la'at midarga ledarga. So again, I mentioned this at the very end, but now we see it inside. Two things that almost are contradictory a little bit. You got to go to the extreme, but don't go in an extreme way. Meaning go to the extreme in gradual increments. So this is slow rather than fast. And the idea is because if you try to take on too much and you try to go to the opposite of your personality, you're going to crack. Now we see this not only in midos, we see this in mitzvos too. We see this all the time. I mean, in Ohr Somayach we see it all the time. That is, some Baal Tshuva comes and, he wants to shave his hair, grow payas, whatever it is, get a shtreimel, when they've been learning Torah for around 6 hours or something. And the point is, so what often happens, not always, but what often happens is a person moves too fast. They crash, they fall, they lose even the madregos that they may have had that they started off with. They're biting off too much, right? I mean, again, physical exercise is a good example. A person wants to improve their health. Should they say, tomorrow morning, I'm doing a 20-mile marathon? Well, assuming they could do it, and it's not likely they could even do it, it's for sure if they do it, they're not going to get out of bed for the next 6 months. So you got to build yourself up gradually in all sorts of ways. Otherwise, you crash. Otherwise, you are overwhelmed. Right? You want to lift weights, so you try to lift 300 pounds or 400 pounds the very first time. Once again, you're going to fall apart. So the paradox is, on one hand, you do have a goal. But even that's a short-term goal. You do have a goal to reach an extreme, but you got to reach the extreme in a gradual, slow way. So you're comfortable with it, so it fits your personality, so it's not too much of a stress. Rav Dessler makes, again, that's not directly relevant, but I think it is connected. Rav Dessler makes a point about chumras. That's a very, very interesting point. Chumras, right? Chumras meaning there's a basic halacha that a person keeps, and then there are different shitas that are machmir, etc. So you can ask a person in the abstract, are chumras good or are chumras bad? Right? So one might say, well, chumra is always good because I'm going beyond the halacha. I'm a bal nefesh. I want to be machmir. I want to be yotzei all the days. Right? So one could say in the abstract, if you're able to do a chumrah, gesundheit, hey, go ahead and be machmir. But Rav Dessler points out that chumras can sometimes be very destructive. Why is that so? Because at any given stage in our lives, our spiritual energy is limited. We have a certain amount of energy that we put in for avodas Hashem, and if you put it in, it's like having let's say a blanket that's too short for the bed. So I pull it to cover this side of the bed, that side of the bed gets uncovered. I pull it to cover that side. In other words, something's going to get uncovered. So he said, I guess, if I put my energy into a chumrah, then there's going to be something else in my avodah that's going to suffer. And I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say a person decides they want to do tikkun chatzos. Now, is doing tikkun chatzos a good thing? It certainly is a good thing. In fact, they have a story. Rav Elya Lapyan, one of the great Baalei Mussar, was already in his 80s or 90s, and he started doing tikkun chatzos. So someone said, the Rebbe in the yeshivas in Lita, they didn't do tikkun chatzos, and you didn't do it for 80 years. Like, why are you doing tikkun chatzos now? So he said, I'm coming to the end of my life, he said, although Baruch Hashem, he lived a long time. And when you go to Shemayim, there's a bechina on the Shulchan Aruch. They go through every sif of Shulchan Aruch. Were you Makayim it? Were you Makayim it? Were you Makayim it? So no. If something is in Siman Tuf Reish 600, all right, by the time they reach 600 and I didn't do something, so I have a track record. But Tikkun Chatzos is in the first sif of the Shulchan Aruch already. He says, if I mess up with the first sif, that kind of looks bad. So I have to do Tikkun Chatzos. This is what he said. So let's assume that I would say, I want to do Tikkun Chatzos. Okay, that's Kabbalah. It's good. If you're only looking at it like an isolated thing, it's great. But there's going to be a ripple effect. You're going to be tired. How will it affect your davening? How will it affect your learning? Right? So like Rav Dester says, you put your energy in Tikkun Chatzos, then some energy is going to be diverted from those other things. Which is more important? Now, right, is davening Shachris more important, or is Tikkun Chatzos more important? Or a married person, you're going to be grouchy, so you'll yell at your wife, whatever it is, be a chisaron of shalom bayis. Which is more important, shalom bayis or tikkun chatzos, right? So one has to think about this, that in a chumrah, you always have to look at what you will be losing by it. And if you will be losing in terms of anxiety, in terms of health, it has to be a cheshbon. I mean, that's why you have to discuss it with somebody. You can't just say, I want to take on more and more things. And that's what the Gemara is saying here as well, that changes have to be gradual. They have to be slow. You want to do more learning, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to stay up till 3 in the morning. It might start with 10 more minutes after Ma'ariv. And then when I feel comfortable and I see it's not affecting me, I could try 15 minutes. Move slow and the like. So there's an interesting point here that on one hand, you're moving to the extreme. On the other hand, you do it gradually, because otherwise you crash, and when you crash, you'll be mafsid, even the madregos that you have. Rav Yashiv used to say, Rav Yashiv, interestingly enough, was really a paradigm of this. He said on himself, he was on, obviously he didn't boast about his godless in Torah, but he said he's boasting about one thing. A very strange thing. He says he is miskoyer. I mean, you would, in a million years, you wouldn't guess how he finished the sentence unless you know the story. He says, he is miskoyer that he never missed a meal. Well, I didn't do it either. I'm sure a lot of us could say that, right? So what is he so proud about? Why does he say he didn't miss a meal? Because he said that even though he was learning, but he knew he had to take time off for his health in that way. And he says he's miskoyer, that he was conscientious, that with all of his hasmada, to take care of physically what needed to be taken care of. Because otherwise the Yetzer Hara could have pulled him down. Like the person, I'm not going to eat, I'm not going to sleep. So it looks like you're doing a gewaldige spiritual avodah, but that can destroy you. That's the Atzas Yetzer Hara itself. In fact, I believe it's brought down that he did not stay up all night Shavuos. He made a cheshbon, it's interesting, that he learned more if he didn't stay up all night, basically. He's looking at his regular schedule, looking at the extra sleep he would need because of it. Lack of sleep can affect a person. So he made a cheshbon that if the ikar is to be marbeh Talmud Torah, not endangering, not jeopardizing his standard schedule. I mean, he got up anyway 2 in the morning. I mean, that was his seder. He went to sleep, I think, like from 10 to 2. That was his, order. They slept like 4 or 5 hours, with maybe a tiny bit in the day. So, in fact, he did it b'dafka because 2 o'clock in the morning, not too many people are calling on the phone or whatever it is. So these were quiet hours. So we had 5 hours. 5 hours of learning, 4 or 5 hours of learning without any interruption. It's interesting that he had a neighbor who was a chashuv, it was a Hasidic Yid, a chashuv Talmid Chacham. So when Rabbi Yashiv would learn, he would learn out loud and he would like explain the Gemara in Yiddish to himself. Frek the Gemara, so he didn't. Rabbi Yashiv didn't know this, but apparently he had a chavrusa for all of Masechah Shabbos and Erevin. Like this other person figured, he would get up at the same time, the other side of the wall there, and Rabbi Yashiv would be learning. And the Imamish had Rabbi Yashiv as a Rebbe explaining the Shaka B'Tarya of the Gemara. He says he learned 2 Masechtas with Rabbi Yashiv as his chavrusa, because you could mamish sit, and if you knew Yiddish, you could mamish get pshat. Rabbi Yashiv would give his share. He had a private shir in that way. See, it doesn't work. Some Gedolim learn quietly, so it doesn't always work. I think with the Chazon Ish it wouldn't have worked because he did a lot of thinking learning. But Rabbi Yashiv said everything out loud, so he says it was a nice chavrusa that way. Okay. But be it as it may, once again, the Yesod HaDvarim is that you got to know when to push yourself and how much to push yourself. Now, what's fascinating is Rav Tzadok, I didn't see it being connected to this Gemara, but Rav Tzadok says in the first sif of Sitkas HaTzadik, which is maybe Rav Tzadok's most famous and most accessible book, because it's like short paragraphs. Some are a little longer, but nothing's more than a page or 2 pages. Like this is like a diary, Rav Tzadok. In fact, I don't even know if he wrote it for publication. This was like a diary of machshavos in Avodas Hashem. So Rav Tzadok says, Reishis Knisas Ha'adam, the way a person enters in Avodas Hashem has to be b'chipazayin. Remember, the Yidden were taken out of Mitzrayim in a rush. They hurried out, chipazayin. In fact, that's why matzah is chipazayin. They didn't have time to let their dough rise. We had to leave because otherwise we would have hit the 50th level of Tumah. So Rav Tzadok says, Hu hadin for every Yitzias Mitzrayim. It has to be b'chipazayin, meaning don't hold on to it. You got to make a fast break. So it always occurred to me that there seems to be maybe a stira or a machlokes about this, because the Gra is saying you gotta move slowly and gradually, and Rav Tzadok seems to be saying you gotta move quickly. You gotta kind of cut yourself off, otherwise you're going to be dragged back to Mitzrayim. So I'm not sure. I mean, Rav Tzadok does not bring the Gra, does not discuss the Gra on this. So I'm not sure if there's a machlokes, or maybe not. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, because maybe the pshat is, you got to make a sudden decision, but the decision goof is gradual, meaning to say, you can't have the attitude, I'll take some time before I start working on this. In other words, you got to start right away. But maybe that doesn't mean you go to the extreme right away. In other words, I'm not sure if this is a machlokes in derech avodah, or they're just referring to 2 different nekudas, that Rav Tzadok is saying, I got to act. And the Gra is saying, yeah, you got to act, but the act will be gradual. Right? So I don't know. So I'll try to go back to Tzidkas HaTzadik and see what he says about that. Okay. Now then, it ends. Achar kach yamaid al nekudas hamutzaas. So far, three things. You move to the extremity, you do so gradually, and the third thing is, and then you move yourself towards the middle rather than the extreme, and then eventually this will become teva, that training your midas eventually becomes a teva sheni, it's called, meaning it's not your nature, but it becomes your nature. In fact, they say, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was, I was zocheh as a child to at least meet Rav Moshe and had a tiny little bit of, very little bit of shaykhs with him. But Rav Moshe Feinstein was a person you would think had no anger at all. I mean, Rav Moshe Feinstein, mamish, makabel kol adam mamish, besever panim yafas, all the time, no matter what. There are stories, there were people who attacked Rav Moshe Feinstein in a lot of ways. He had controversial psukim about artificial insemination and other things, and there were Satmar Hasidim that burnt him in effigy. They burnt pictures of him and the like, and they were mavaza him, and they said that he's an Amoritz. They said mamish, painful things. And the story goes that a Satmar Chassid came to him, and when the family saw that he was coming to him, they wanted to kick him out. And Moshe said, "What are you doing?" He says, "This guy has the chutzpah. He was involved in a campaign against you. Now he has a chutzpah. He wants you to give him a Kabbalah to be a shochet." He says, "He's coming to you. How can that be?" And Rav Moshe said, "Before Yom Kippur, we said Tfilas Zaka. And in Tfilas Zaka, what do we say? I'm mochel anybody that hurt me." He said to his family, "Didn't you say Tfilas Zaka? I was mochel him. If I was mochel him, how can I be angry at him?" And he said, what are you talking about? I was mochel him. And that was Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe was that way in every interaction. But Rav Moshe once said, "Do you think I didn't work on this?" I don't know. I don't know if Rav Moshe had a bad temper. How can I say? I don't know. But at least Rav Moshe self-describes himself as beteva, having anger, very quick to anger, and he worked on himself to develop savlanos and patience and forgiveness. And that's what the Gemara says. And eventually it became like a teva. Rav Hutner wrote years and years ago that he didn't like Gedolim biographies, which were beginning then, the genre of Gedolim, because all the Gedolim biographies are kind of the same. Although Baruch Hashem, they've improved actually. And Jonathan Rosenbaum, I think, has a big chalik in improving them. But it used to be like a standard story about the brilliant, genius, tzaddik 4-year-old that, he knew Shas when he was 4, and he knew Yerushalmi at 5, and knew Zohar at 6, and amazing, he only slept like 15 minutes a day, and story after story after story about how wondrous they were, how great they were, how genius they were. In some cases it was true, Taka, but Rav Hutner's taina was, what do you learn from such a story? I mean, these are madregas that have no shaykhs to us. We're never going to be that. So essentially it becomes entertainment. Whoa, I'm reading, Ripley's Believe It or Not, like, the tallest person in the world, the person who could hit a baseball furthest, the person who could learn the most blot of Gemara in a minute. Okay, but it's not nogea to me. It doesn't change me. So Rav Hutner said, the big mistake is that not all Gedolim were like born Gedolim. Gedolim had at least some. Number one, some of them were not naturally so gifted. Number two, some of them worked on their midah. Some of them had struggles. Some of them had issues. So Rav Hutner said, it would have been now you do have a shaila about Lashon Hara, that's where you get into a problem. But he says, what we really need is to understand the struggles and nisyonis of great people. That they weren't necessarily born on the highest level. But they also had struggles. They also had issues. They had midos they had to work on. We know the Chafetz Chaim, when he was 70 or 80, trained himself that if he heard Lashon Hara, he fell asleep. But what was the Chafetz Chaim at 15? Right? Maybe he liked, maybe he liked to hear gossip. Now, to write that type of biography, you understand, number one, we don't have a lot of information, and number two, there are Lashon Hara. I mean, am I supposed to say, oh yeah, I remember when the Chafetz Chaim was in school, he did so-and-so, there are Lashon Hara issues. One could argue it's Tayelas. And there was one attempt, actually, we do have one biography that was written that way, and that got in Cherem. This was Rav Nosson Kamenetsky, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky's son, wrote a biography not only of his father, it was about his father, but it was about the whole yeshiva movement. And he talked about this. Gadol used to write to girls. I mean, he wrote a lot of interesting, really, really interesting things. And there's a big, big tayelis in knowing this. But some Gedolim felt this was a bizayon of Kavod HaTorah. So I'm not going to give you a psak, obviously, but Rav Hutner's point is still well taken, that you can learn much from the struggles of a great person, not just unbroken hatzlacha, because when I see that they struggled, I see that they worked on themselves. That's very important. It's not just you're born a great person. You work on yourself. And that's what the Gemara is saying. Teva sheni. You're born a certain way. That's your teva rishon. And you're kind of stuck with that. But it's not unchangeable, meaning to say you can work and work and work till it becomes a teva sheni. And Rav Moshe was made on himself. So it's not Lashon Hara, because Rav Moshe was made on himself. That Rav Moshe b'teva, he said, had anger. And anyone who knew Rav Moshe saw that the anger was totally removed from himself. And he said that was through effort, and that was, and the like. So B'ez Hashem, a person should never be miyayish, that it is always possible to be misakin. Okay,